At first glance, the new chiseled bookshelves in Minecraft 1.20 might just seem like another ordinary block. However, as we take a closer look, we begin to uncover some strange redstone capacities and an ancient design unlike any other block currently in the game. And so, could these bookshelves hold a deeper secret? And are they a clue to a lost story waiting to be uncovered? Well, join me as we dive deep into the mystery of these chiseled bookshelves. In a time long, long ago, there was once a very technologically advanced civilization. And this civilization loved to learn and deepen their knowledge on both themselves and the world around them. And so because of that, most of the citizens of that civilization had massive libraries in their homes, where they stored all kinds of educational books. And these varied from how they believed the overworld was created, to the complex mechanics of how a piston worked. Everything was in those books. And so those books became vital to that civilization's preservation and growth of knowledge. However, there was a problem. You see, these bookshelves that they were using to store all of these highly detailed and very important books were basic. Very basic in fact, as they were just 2 planks of wood with books shoved in between. And so it was because of that that many of these libraries were deemed to be old-fashioned and were really quite inefficient at gathering knowledge, as many would have to spend hours looking in the library trying to find the correct book. As with these bookshelves, well, it was almost impossible to organize. But at the same time, this civilization had many other grand pieces of technology that fixed many other issues in the past. And so, in theory, it must have been possible for them to combine their advanced technology with this bookshelf to fix this problem. And well, that was exactly the thought of 2 engineer brothers within one of their cities. And so it took those brothers several years working together, spending tireless nights in the workshop, attempting to develop a solution, before they finally did it. As after all that effort, they had created the chiseled bookshelf. Now, these bookshelves look quite similar to the old ones, except these new ones were slightly neater, as they had a slab divider in the middle of them, and had individual sections designated for each of the 6 books for every bookshelf, which overall gave these chiseled bookshelves a much cleaner appearance. But more than just looking nicer and having a better organizational layout, these bookshelves also strategically had a thin enough base that hoppers were able to pick up books from within the bookshelf, and within enough on the top layer, the books could also be automatically put back in via a hopper as well. Now, to you and I, this might seem meaningless, but to that civilization, it was a game changer. As now, using these new chiseled bookshelves in collaboration with their other technology, they were now able to easily set up automated book systems, where all one needed to do was to just press a few buttons and the designated book would be taken to them. And that was amazing for them, as there was no longer any need to waste hundreds of hours a year looking for specific books in messy libraries, as now it could all be done in just a matter of seconds. And so, as it proved to save so much time for the civilization, and did actually look quite cool, many of them began to buy them. In fact, in just a few months, most libraries in that civilization had been entirely converted into these new chiseled bookshelves with automatic book systems attached, which meant very quickly those 2 brothers became very rich. Now, at that point, they could have stopped. They had fixed an issue that the civilization had had and were now rich beyond their wildest dreams. But they didn't stop, as they still saw an opportunity to further improve their technology. And so it was using all their newfound wealth that they began hiring the smartest scientists in the world. And it was together that they all began to experiment on their bookshelves, trying to find any ways that they could possibly improve them. And well, it took them all just over a year of constant working. When they were finished, there were now no more ways that they could think of to improve their bookshelves. And it was after much rigorous testing to make sure that everything was working that they released the improved version of the chiseled bookshelf. Now, on the surface, it looked basically the same as the old one. But on the inside, it was actually quite different, as they had now developed a way of adding these tiny weights onto the different compartments of the bookshelf, which meant that they can now detect where books were and where books weren't, which meant that they can now output a redstone signal depending on that data. Not only that, they had also found a way of creating a new elegant top design for their chiseled bookshelves, which really encompassed this advanced civilization quite well. But now back onto that redstone capacity. With the ability now to output a redstone signal, these new contraptions could be made, such as hidden doorways, retracting stairs, and, most importantly, even more advanced bookkeeping stations. And so once again, when this new design was released to the world, very quickly, many were bought. As with these new redstone abilities, their book sorting technology became even more efficient, which meant there was even less time that they needed to wait for their books. And so, everyone was happy, as they loved these new bookshelves. And so life would continue to develop for all and everything else, now that that issue was resolved. And they would stay on this exponential trajectory of growth and prosperity for centuries, with the backbone of all of it being those advanced bookshelves, which allowed them to store all of these grand new discoveries. However, that would all come to an end in one week-long catastrophic event. Now, I'll get into more detail of what happened there later, but for now, all you need to know is that 99% of that civilization were killed in just that 1 week. But as for those remaining survivors, well, they had two options. They either had to flee outside of their lavish cities, carrying whatever they could, and get out into the wild areas of the overworld, or had to go into the unknown dangers of the Nether. Now, it would be at this point that it would be more than likely to be expected that those advanced bookshelves would just become another lost technology, as surely those fleeing couldn't bring those extremely heavy bookshelves with them, right? Well, if you thought that they didn't bring them, you would be wrong, as they did, because their ability to carry all those valuable books that contained millions of years of research and development was seen as highly important to preserve, even when many of them thought they were going to die. And so because of that, many of those fleeing ripped those chiseled bookshelves right out of their automatic book systems as they fled, as they truly did believe with those books they would eventually be able to recover to where they once were. However, little did they know what was coming to them. But for now, let's just focus on what was happening to those survivors, as the survivors were split into two groups. One was in the Nether, and one was in the overworld, and they couldn't really interact anymore, as the borders were shut off. And so for now, let's focus on the first group in the Nether. Now, those going into the Nether knew it was going to be dangerous the moment they ran through those portals, but they didn't realise just how dangerous it was going to be, as there were fires all around them, and guards were constantly trying to shoot them down, and food was scarce. And so because of that, many of them would have died long and painful deaths. And the books that they were carrying, well, they would have just been burnt, and so all the knowledge that they were carrying would have been lost. But that was just most of them. Some of them may have not died like that. And well, for those survivors, there were two possible things that might have happened to them. The first is the more unlikely one, but still, here we go. They might have somehow found a portal in the Nether and decided to venture within, as anything was better than here. And that portal might have taken them to a brand new dimension that was filled with life and abundance and safety. And so it would be there that they could use those books that they were carrying to restart civilization. And they succeeded, and were able to build massive structures using not only the blocks that were in that new world, but also the Nether quartz, which was very common, and they would have gathered a lot of it in the Nether. And it's likely that they were even able to make a block of quartz dedicated to the beings in that world, with the same level of detail that they had made the top design of the chiseled bookshelves, as all chisel blocks do have some sort of meaning, and that could be the answer for the quartz block. And well, if that was the case, and they did find that portal, well, it's likely that they would have all lived happily ever after, and all would continue to be good. As over time, they would have likely evolved that environment, and they probably would have closed their portal to the Nether, which would mean that they had become completely detached from the normal world. Now, that's just the unlikely scenario. The more likely course of events is that those survivors only made it a few more days, as they might have been able to find some sort of food as they eat the fungi from around the area. But it's very likely that eventually they would have died at the hands of the piglins, who likely would have stolen all their books because they did look quite cool, but because they couldn't read, they would have thought that they were just useless and would have likely have just thrown them into the lava oceans. Meaning all knowledge that was ever brought into the Nether in that scenario would be lost forever. But now, on the other hand, back in the overworld, the events that unfolded there after the survivors fled their cities, well, they were quite different to that of the Nether, as not all their knowledge was lost. Well, not yet anyway. And so it was over the next few weeks after leaving that city that they would trek through the forests of the overworld, just searching for other survivors, all whilst hauling those extremely heavy bookshelves on their back. Now, this wouldn't have been a problem if everything was going well, but everything wasn't going well. In fact, everything was just going terribly, as they'd run out of food and were now having to forage for berry scraps. It was raining most of the time. They were also always very tired, as they had to keep moving as the threat was encroaching on them, and they hadn't found any other survivors. And they were also getting extremely weak, as a lot of their energy was being used up on hauling those important books. And well, it got to a point where it just wasn't possible to take those books with them anymore, as they just couldn't afford to waste any more strength on the preservation of those books. They needed to go out hunting for more nutritious food, or else they were going to starve. And so a very tough decision had to be made. They were going to have to abandon all of their books and go hunting. Now, a lot of them were quite reluctant to do that, as those books were so important to them. But at the same time, they had no choice. And so it was on one rainy night that they threw all the books they had into a cave, marked the coordinates, and left. And those survivors intended on returning soon, once they had built up some farms and were able to survive long term. Well, that was their plan anyway. However, none of them would ever return. And so those piles of books were left in those caves for hundreds of years, which meant over time, nature began to take them, as the moss began to consume those books, and the trees around began to cover them up, sealing the darkness around those books, stealing all their light. And well, after a few hundred years, it got to a point where you couldn't even see those books anymore, not if you didn't look extremely carefully. And so it looked as if all those books and all the knowledge that they contained would also be lost forever. However, it was on one sunny morning when an evoker who was just wandering around the area looking for a village spotted it. And so he went to investigate, and when he did, he was shocked at what he saw, as there were only legends about these books that the ancient civilization had written them and hidden them before, well, dying out. And more than just learning that he had just found these legendary books that were thought to have been lost for centuries, he could also read them. And so he called out to all the nearby villagers, whom all worked together and moved them all back to the woodland mansion, where they all began to read the books and do some experiments on these strange bookshelves that they were in. And what they ended up finding changed their lives and the overworld as a whole forever, as they read about all these grand pieces of technology and how to make them. And to them, this was almost like magic. All of this was nothing like anything they'd ever heard of in their entire lives. And so it was with this magic that they were able to increase their strength greatly and become a greater force than even the villagers whom they were fighting. And so it was amazing for the Illagers. Not only could they fight the villagers more efficiently, they could also develop so many other things in their lives, as the ancient civilization had written down every single one of their discoveries, which the Illagers now had. And so it would be over the next few decades that the Illagers would rise to gain control of the entire overworld. However, because these books had helped them so greatly, and they had become so reliant on them, many evokers began fearing that if the villagers ever found any of these books, they too could gain all these grand advancements that they had, and because they were larger in numbers, they could likely overpower them. And so it was ordered on one day that all of these books and all the knowledge that they hold should be translated into a language that no one can understand. Then all the bookshelves, all the books, everything would be burned, as they didn't want to risk the villagers finding it. But hold on, if they just translated that book into a language that they didn't even understand, hadn't they just lost all that knowledge too? Well, no, as that book, which became known as the Knowledge Book, was placed into a monstrous AI that the evokers had just been able to create using the knowledge that they had learned. And their plan was to create only one of this AI and to have it completely under the control of the Illagers. And so that monster was going to have the knowledge of all the ancient civilizations' technology, meaning they were going to be able to build anything that the Illagers commanded that the ancient civilization would have been able to build. And more than that, this monster was going to be powered by dark magic, meaning this AI monster was going to be one of the strongest beasts in existence, and had powers of the Totem of Undying, meaning it could be revived an infinite amount of times. And not only that, it had over 10 hearts, and had enough strength to lift up a mountain. This monster was going to ruin the world for the villagers, and was going to make the Illagers the greatest beings ever known to the overworld, for now and forever. And that monster was none other than the Steve, also known as you. Now, as it turns out, that AI had somehow gained a mind of its own and turned on its creator, the Illagers, whom now have ordered a death sentence on you to get that book of knowledge back, as now, without it, the Illagers are unable to advance in their technology, as they only created one knowledge book, and you have it. Now, as the AI monster, you might not remember much of those events, but because you still have that knowledge book, you can still craft much of that ancient civilization's technology. For example, you can create the chiseled bookshelf. And so that puts us to where we are today. And, well, that's the complete story of what happened with those bookshelves. Except, not quite. As it turns out, that's not the entire story for these chiseled bookshelves. No. As there was actually one instance involving these bookshelves that occurred long before the Illagers ever found them. As a few 100,000 years prior, a few villagers would actually find one of these chiseled bookshelves within that exact same spruce forest. Now, they only found one of these with only one book, but that book was very influential for the villagers, and in fact still affects them today, as it was from that book that they would learn about what was at the time the undiscovered jungle biome, a biome that was foretold to have the best conditions for life in the entire overworld. And so hearing about that from this mysterious book began millions of villagers' journey across the world as they would begin to search for it. And when, just a few years later, they found these jungle biomes, well, it would begin the very first thriving village in the world. A village that would morph the villagers into who they are today. But to learn more about that, then you'll need to watch this video.